Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The webinar will be beginning shortly. I'm just going to give a little bit of time for everybody to get into the room. I'll take a second to tell you about some upcoming events that we have for you. On Wednesday, September 15th, we have Preventing Slips, Trips, and Falls, Current Research and Trends with Dr. Andrew Merriweather of the Rocky Mountain Center for Occupational Environmental Health at the University of Utah. On Tuesday, October 5th, our very own Rachel Sklar, Dr. Rachel Sklar from Northern California ERC will be presenting Promoting Sanitation, Worker Health, and Safety Through Social Enterprise. And then on Wednesday, October 6th, COEH will be having a special presentation on health literacy and practice, risk communication with Anthony Belterion and Becca Freed from UC Berkeley's Health Research for Action Center. For more information and other upcoming events, you can visit us at coeh.berkeley.edu/about-CE. All right, let's get started. So on behalf of the Center for Occupational Environmental Health, I would like to welcome you to our webinar. A few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box. We will save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health's YouTube page. All participants who logged in today with their registration email will receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording and an evaluation form that will qualify participants for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once the evaluation is complete, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. At this time, I am very pleased to welcome our presenters. Rebecca K. Vortman, DNP, RN, CNOR, is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago, teaching Doctor of Nursing practice courses for the Population Health Nursing Science Department and serves as a perioperative education consultant. Dr. Vortman has over 10 years of experience in perioperative nursing, education, and leadership. Dr. Vortman is recognized as a national leader through the AORN 40 Under 40 program. Her policy focus is on workplace safety initiatives and surgical smoke evacuation practices. She has disseminated her scholarly work through publications and presentations at the local, regional, and national levels. Dr. Vortman is an advocate for surgical smoke evacuation practices and is certified as an operating room nurse, CNOR, through the Competency and Credentialing Institute. Our second presenter, Janet Thorlton, PhD, MS, RN, CNE, is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Population Health at the University of Illinois College of Nursing. She has received several teaching awards for designing impactful graduate level health policy courses. Over the last 15 years, she has mentored students and faculty on how to follow a step-by-step process for writing a policy analysis, resulting in multiple publications. She was selected to present Nurses Leading the Way Through Innovative Approaches in Health Policy Curricula at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Nursing and Health Policy Collaborative. She attended George Mason University's Washington Health Policy Institute and served as a professional nurse cabinet member for Senator Jim Merritt's initiative for reducing heroin use in Indiana. Aspects of her research have led to building health policy competency in nursing programs, influencing nurses to work together to advocate and reduce preventable harm from substance misuse, abuse, and errors. Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to talk today about surgical smoke, the research on this topic, and the policy analysis we conducted on the issue through this webinar. We are delighted to be here today. My name is Rebecca Vortman, and I will start us off today with our presentation, and Dr. Thorlton will present later on in this presentation. Dr. Thorlton and I are interested in this topic as we have both worked in the surgical environment. Where I previously worked at a level 1 trauma center in the Midwest, I served as a perioperative nurse, working on the orthopedic service line, where I mostly cared for patients undergoing total knee and hip replacements. And during this time, I was exposed on a daily basis to surgical smoke. I also held positions as a clinical case coordinator, where I was in charge of leading quality improvement initiatives. And I also served as the perioperative education manager and developed various educational initiatives for the perioperative departments. And I have continued my practice in perioperative nursing by conducting research and by being an active advocate for the health and safety of perioperative teams. And I will share more of my journey with you later in this presentation. But first, I'd like to share that we have no conflicts of interest to disclose. The presentation also should not contain any promotion of commercial goods or services that may constitute a conflict of interest. And in this presentation, we refer to nurses, scrub technicians, anesthesia personnel, and surgeons as perioperative personnel. So let's go ahead and get started. Our objectives for today are to discuss surgical smoke exposure potential in the healthcare industry. We are going to identify the potential health risks to perioperative personnel exposed to surgical smoke. And we will also list actions to help protect perioperative personnel and patients from the dangers of surgical smoke. And lastly, we're going to analyze surgical smoke as a health policy issue. So when we began writing our policy analysis about surgical smoke, we needed to first uncover background information. And what we found was surgical smoke is the encompassing term for a number of gaseous byproducts produced by energy-based surgical instruments. And surgical smoke is also known as plume, aerosols, cautery smoke, diathermy plume, and smoke plume. So the exact energy devices that generate surgical smoke include lasers, electrosurgical systems, radio frequency devices, ultrasonic scalpels, and some power tools. So depending on the procedure, various types of the above mentioned energy sources are used to cut, dissect, coagulate, and ablate the patient's tissue. So for example, a patient undergoing a total knee or hip replacement, your surgeon will use electrocautery to cut and coagulate the tissue. And when this happens, surgical smoke is produced and it's visible and you can see it, you can smell it. And in this slide, I've tried to kind of give you a visualization of the smoke moving across the slide here for you. So here's a little bit more on some background information. Data from NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety, released findings from a health and safety practices survey of healthcare workers. The healthcare workers reported that only 14% were evacuating surgical smoke during electrosurgery procedures, and 47% reported use of those evacuation systems during laser procedures. There were about 4,500 survey respondents in this particular study. And this study highlights the opportunity for the crucial need for increased education about the danger of being exposed to surgical smoke plume during cases where electrocautery is used. And also, we need to understand what we're doing with our new energy generating devices that have emerged in our practice since the study. And I would also like to mention and define what a policy analysis is before we begin talking more in depth about surgical smoke and our policy analysis. So the purpose of writing a policy analysis is to provide informed advice to a client that relates to a public policy decision and provides a recommended course of action or inaction, and it's framed by the client's powers and values. So the client is the particular stakeholder that has an interest in the issue at hand. And when you write a policy analysis, you will want that information to be included in the analysis to convey all sides of an issue. And one of my scholarly pursuits was to conduct a principle-based concept analysis on surgical smoke. My team followed Penrod and Hoopsey's principle-based concept analysis, which is a form of a method when you conduct a concept analysis. And they use 4 general principles, and they are epistemological, pragmatic, linguistic, and logical principles that we analyze. to thoroughly define surgical smoke and identify implications for perioperative personnel, patients, researchers, and policymakers. So based on our analysis and what we identified in the literature, we defined surgical smoke as a visible plume of aerosolized combustion byproducts produced by heat generating surgical instruments. It consists of water vapor and gaseous substances. It can carry toxic chemicals, bacteria, viruses, and tumors. It can also obscure the surgical field for the surgeon, and it can be inhaled. Surgical smoke has a distinctive noxious odor and can cause physical symptoms such as watery eyes and throat irritation. The most common term identified in this analysis was surgical smoke, and other terms that have been documented in the literature include plume, smoke plume, and diathermy, but we found the uniform language presented in our concept analysis and our definition presented will facilitate an understanding of surgical smoke and its surrogate terms. And just to go into a little more detail about our concept analysis, we generated defining characteristics of surgical smoke, and we determined that surgical smoke appears in the environment when the surgical team uses specific surgical tools to cut, resect, destroy, or cauterize living tissue for the purpose of treating or curing an underlying issue or problem that the patient has come to the OR to have an intervention of that health problem. So the vapor, smoke, or plume that is created when heat generating surgical instruments are used generally occurs in a highly controlled environment with regard to personnel. We have airflow going on in the OR, specific temperatures, and it's a sterile environment with our surgical tools. So this means that surgical smoke is very unique to this type of environment, and it really can't be confused in any other environment. So the cautery and laser devices that are used to cut and dissect and control bleeding do so by destroying cells and tissue, which then creates this toxic visible plume of vapor that, if not properly evacuated from the environment, may cause immediate and long-term health effects for perioperative personnel. And for surgical smoke to be created, the planned procedure must require heat generating instruments. So the resulting surgical smoke is readily visible and has a distinct odor that is unlikely to be confused with other odors. And therefore, we concluded that surgical smoke is a mature concept unique to the perioperative environment. And one solution to address the problem of surgical smoke exposure is to implement surgical smoke evacuation systems, which consists of smoke evacuation capture devices and various tubing and electrosurgical pencils that will capture the smoke to filter it and then remove it, so the perioperative teams are not breathing in the contaminants. And a question that often comes up when discussing surgical smoke is, how much is it going to cost the facility to implement? And it's difficult to determine the exact cost of devices because it will vary between companies selling their products, the size of the facility, and what kind of contracts and negotiations the hospital facility can conduct with the vendors. So the main takeaway message is the cost of surgical smoke evacuation systems is relatively low and inexpensive. And one important aspect of conducting a policy analysis is to take a look at the cost of proposed solutions. And also the cost for routine smoke evacuation is difficult to determine due to the proliferation of companies manufacturing surgical smoke evacuation devices. And just to kind of give you an idea of the impact of surgical smoke, a common statistic frequently cited in the literature to identify the impact is the number of perioperative team members exposed to the substance of smoke plume created during surgical procedures using these heat generating tools. And the last reported number is roughly 500,000 healthcare workers are exposed annually. However, I suspect that this number is much higher now, especially with the growth of procedures being performed in ambulatory surgery centers. And researchers may want to replicate this study. And then also another frequently cited statistic in the literature is perioperative nurses reported twice as many respiratory issues compared to the general public. And we recognize these are older studies. And for those of you listening today who may be researchers or are interested in conducting research in this area, we really recommend researchers replicate these studies to understand what the current state is and expand these studies to all perioperative team members. During surgical procedures, we typically have a wide variety of roles depending on the type of procedure, and some procedures may have several surgeons, several nurses, several techs involved in a case. So you could have anywhere between 5 or more healthcare providers taking care of one patient at a time. And in a statistical brief reported by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, there were over 15 million surgical procedures performed in 2011 in the United States. And in 2016, 13.6 million major ambulatory surgeries were performed in hospital-owned facilities. And then if you take this on an international level, there are approximately 300 million surgeries performed annually. So it is difficult to know the current and exact number of people being exposed to surgical smoke, but this gives you an idea that this number is expected to be quite high given the number of surgical procedures that are performed each year. And as you can see on this slide, I have listed about 8 perioperative team members needed to perform one surgical procedure on one patient. So we could see more or less people depending on the type of procedure being performed. Now that I have briefly touched on what surgical smoke is, I would like to share the potential health risks from exposure to surgical smoke. Our perioperative colleagues have reported experiencing such symptoms like respiratory issues such as chronic bronchitis, asthma, nasal and throat irritation, tearing of their eyes, nausea, vomiting, anemia, leukemia, shortness of breath, several viruses such as HPV, and also headache, anxiety, and it does have the potential for carcinoma. And one of my common symptoms from working in many orthopedic surgeries, like a total hip replacement, for example, I experienced frequent sore throats. And what I noticed is as soon as I transitioned out of the OR and into a different position where I wasn't breathing the surgical smoke 5 days or more a week, the frequent sore throats just stopped. We have many stories of our perioperative colleagues who have shared over the years. We've heard of team members being diagnosed with lung cancer, and some team members have had to undergo bilateral lung transplants. So this does have some effects on our team members. Another question I am often asked is, why is compliance of surgical smoke evacuation an issue? Well, in the literature, you'll find reported barriers to compliance. And in a perfect world, the healthcare facility should have a policy and procedure in place to evacuate the smoke using smoke evacuation systems. However, this isn't as simple as it sounds. Despite all the hazards we have shared with you today, surgical smoke evacuation practices are not routine, and they really should be. So noted here is a concept map that we created after reviewing a few articles about the reported barriers to compliance when deciding to use surgical smoke evacuation devices. Some of the common themes found in the literature include lack of managerial support to establish policies and procedures to evacuate the surgical smoke. Surgical team members may not realize the risk and hazards from surgical smoke exposure, leading to non-compliance. And the surgeons are under a lot of pressure to perform surgery, and using new equipment may be perceived as a barrier for them. However, the surgical smoke evacuation technologies have emerged over time since some of these studies were conducted, and the technology is a lot easier to use now. For example, in the past, investigators reported device designs were bulky, noisy, heavy, and awkward to handle or prone to clogging. So with that in mind, this is why it is so important for facilities to adopt policies and procedures and include the entire surgical team when selecting these surgical smoke evacuation devices. And this slide came directly from the Association of Perioperative Registered Nurses, their surgical smoke safety guidelines, and we have cited the source from AORN and did receive permission from them to use for our presentation today. But what's important about this image is this illustration demonstrates the size of the particles generated by the various energy generating devices. As I mentioned in a previous slide, our surgeon colleagues use various types of energy devices that produce surgical smoke plume. And this picture illustrates how the particle sizes differ based on the energy device used. So as you can see, the laser generates a particle size that is about 0.31 microns, and the electrocautery or electrosurgery generates 0.07 microns. And next you will see where the various sized particles can be deposited. Larger particles deposit in the nasopharynx, and the smaller particles generated by electrocautery devices deposit in the alveoli of the lungs. So this is why our smoke evacuation systems need to have that 0.1 micron filtration system in order to adequately capture, filter, and remove the smoke plume before it enters the respiratory system of our perioperative team members. And now I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Thorlton.
Hi, everyone. By now, you may be starting to think, wow, with everything that Dr. Vortman has shared, have there been any lawsuits? So over the next few slides, I'm going to talk briefly about how you can learn more about that and then share some research findings. At the bottom of each slide, I have link to each source that I've cited, and that will take you directly to the article. So I wanted to talk a little bit about where you can go for more information. As Dr. Vortman said, this is an up and coming topic, and as the public and perioperative personnel become aware and possibly experience some side effects and associated health hazards, employers should be aware of the legal implications from a lack of supplies and facility policies to evacuate surgical smoke. So we've taken a look at this background history, which has been slowly evolving over the course of the last 20 years or so, 30 years maybe. So one resource that's available, especially to those who work in an academic setting, is a database called the LexisNexis database. You may have access to this if you happen to work in a law firm, but for some of you, you may not have access to that. So I'm going to talk about several ways that you can obtain information about lawsuits. So LexisNexis features news, business, legal sources, federal and state cases. They share US Supreme Court decisions on different topics. So I would recommend, if you're not familiar with using the LexisNexis database, that you seek the help of a librarian who is familiar with that particular database. Because when you log in, you can conduct a query, and then it's going to display some preliminary findings with a series of symbols that are considered shepherd signals. And you may see like a red stop sign, a yellow triangle, a little green square, that type of thing. And these color-coded symbols each are sort of like an at-a-glance summary of that particular case. Well, sometimes cases happen 30 or 40 years ago, and in healthcare, we talk frequently about evidence-based practice. And we strive to deliver care that's based on sound best practices for the year 2021. So we would be considered negligent if we went back in time and delivered care the way it was provided, say, in 1930. So the same thing happens with law. They make decisions using the best information they have at the time, and then that gets put on the books as a case that's cited. But sometimes things evolve and the standards change and practice changes, and an issue can evolve into a different appearing situation than what it was when that lawsuit may have happened. So hence the reason for these color-coded signals that are found in the LexisNexis database. So You'll find that some cases are not recommended to be citable because they're maybe becoming a little outdated or they're unique to one geographic area. And then they have a yellow one that's like, well, you can use this case with caution. And then green means this is pretty current. We feel it might apply to a lot of people. So this is a great one to consider citing. So that's one way you can gain information. Another is simply using Google Scholar. If you type Google Scholar into Google, it'll take you to a slightly different appearing screen, and you can select case law, and you can query for case law using Google Scholar. A third way is to just do a general Google search, and you'll find that, like we did, you'll see the in blue, free case consultation. The law firms are beginning to look for perioperative personnel to report their exposure experiences. And so this is kind of has evolved even since we started planning to prepare for this presentation. And then a final thing that you might consider looking at is the Seyfarth Shaw Employment Law Lookout publication. This is kind of like it's a great resource for employers seeking updates on today's most pressing workplace issues. To access this, you can just type in the title that we have here, Holy Smoke, Healthcare Employers Must Abate Surgical Smoke Hazards in the Operating Room. And that's going to connect you with the Labor and Employment Law Council.com website, where you can get additional information. So a synopsis on this topic, the Holy Smoke headline, is basically that smoke produced during surgical procedures has been deemed carcinogenic and can carry pathogens. And employers who fail to abate surgical smoke hazards may be facing a liability. So this is an evolving topic, and we'll move on to the next slide, where I'll talk a little bit about best practices, standards, and study findings. So we've just bullet pointed here for you kind of a list of stakeholders who have an interest in surgical smoke as a topic. We're going to revisit the topic of stakeholders again a little bit later when Dr. Vortman wraps up on more specific details on conducting a policy analysis. So these are some of the stakeholders that are involved in this important topic. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are some research studies that we located that just help to substantiate the importance of this topic. This first study by Palma et al. Was published in 2021, and they conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis using 30 studies. Some of these were animal studies and some were human. And what they learned is that for those surgeons using a CO2 laser to destroy tissue, were almost 6 times more likely to develop oral, nasal, and pharyngeal lesions. So this would be in their nose, tonsils, and upper throat area. So if you'd like to read more about this meta-analysis, I've got the citation at the bottom of the screen. Next slide, please. Another study that was of interest is, so we've talked about, on the last slide was human papillomavirus. So that could be a gynecologist performing that surgery, typically on trying to remove warts. Well, let's move to a different type of surgeon, and that would be a urologist. So this is a slightly different angle for which we see things. And where these authors concluded that fine particles from surgical smoke impact the urologist in the operating by the amount of time they're exposed to the smoke and the distance they are from the smoke when they're breathing it. So they looked at electrocautery and other surgical techniques that can generate surgical smoke with a high proportion of fine particles being emitted. And if you think back on that slide that Dr. Vortman discussed, where they had the pictures of the lung, she emphasize that the smaller particles are the ones that travel down and actually park themselves in the alveoli of the lung. So what they found is that the surgical smoke evacuation in the first few seconds of making the incision is essential because these fine smoke particles really are going to impact the person who is closest to the incision site. Next slide, please. Here we are again with another study on fine particles. This one published in 2021 in a very high impact journal. These authors have found that fine particles in surgical smoke affect embryonic cardiomyocyte differentiation through oxidative stress and metophagy. These investigators proposed that fine particles in surgical smoke and those in the atmosphere exhibit a level of toxicity toward embryonic development. I know when I worked in the OR many years ago, we had, we didn't know why, but it seemed a high rate of miscarriages in some of the nurses and also miscarriages in the spouses of the anesthesiologists. So at that time, we didn't think about surgical smoke or the off-gassing of the different cements they use in surgery, the residual anesthetic gases that we're breathing in the operating room environment. So it really is a complex environment where there are a lot of precautions that are being taken nowadays to try to help protect workers. So in conclusion of this study, the fine particles in surgical smoke have been determined to affect the beating cardiomyocytes by damaging the mitochondria in the embryo and increasing oxidative stress. Okay, and next slide, please. Okay, and then this is a final study, a systematic review of the literature that talks about risk of virus contamination through surgical smoke during minimally invasive surgery. This was also published in a high impact journal. It was a review of 24 studies, a systematic review. And the investigators looked at the risk of virus spread through surgical smoke exposure during surgery. And that although not a single study was not found to be related to severe COVID or any variation of COVID or coronavirus, they do feel that there is a theoretical risk of virus diffusion through surgical smoke that can't be excluded. So that concludes my portion. I'll let Dr. Vortman take over.
Thank you, Dr. Thorlton. I have one last study to mention before we move on about our policy analysis into further detail. My colleagues, Dr. McPherson and Windler, and I conducted a 2-round Delphi study to uncover operating room nurses' knowledge and concerns regarding surgical smoke. And from our 2-round Delphi study, we found the implementation of surgical smoke evacuation practices to be inconsistent and affected by many factors. So we determined nurses are aware of and concerned about the likely health hazards of exposure to surgical smoke in their workplaces. However, in our study, we concluded that some institutions may not be using surgical smoke mitigation practices, indicating that recommended practices and standards are not always used in the perioperative environment. So we selected the Delphi process as a new approach to explore surgical smoke concerns and evacuation practices. When we were conducting a literature search, we did not uncover any Delphi studies in the literature on this specific topic. And we wanted to offer a new perspective and technique by using the Delphi method to contribute to the body of surgical smoke literature. The study also confirms that laws are needed because from this small sample of perioperative nurses that participated in our surveys, not every facility is using smoke evacuation devices to protect their perioperative team members, which is why we're here today and why we wrote a policy analysis paper as well. Oh, I'm on mute. I'm so sorry. Let me go back. I'll briefly summarize this study. My colleagues, Drs. McPherson and Windler, and I conducted a 2-round Delphi technique study to uncover operating room nurses' knowledge and concerns regarding surgical smoke. So basically what we found was nurses are aware of and concerned about the likely health hazards of exposure to surgical smoke in the workplace. However, in our study, we conducted that some institutions may not be using surgical smoke mitigation practices, indicating that recommended practices and standards are not always used in our environment. And we selected the Delphi process as a new approach to explore surgical smoke concerns and evacuation practices and to contribute to the body of literature on this topic. Okay, on this slide, the status of pending surgical smoke evacuation legislation is always changing. And here is a snapshot of states that have introduced legislation in 2021. And we have also included the states that have enacted surgical smoke evacuation laws in the United States. So as you can see on this slide, 5 states have successfully enacted laws requiring healthcare facilities evacuate surgical smoke. These states are Rhode Island, Colorado, Kentucky, and recently Oregon and Illinois. And they're noted in that darker orange color. And then also the following states have introduced legislation in 2021. And this includes Connecticut, Georgia, Iowa, New Jersey, Ohio, and Texas. We continue to watch this and hope to see more states successfully pass legislation as the new legislative sessions begin. And I am very pleased and excited to share with you today that Illinois became the 5th state to enact a surgical smoke plume evacuation law. I would like to extend a special thanks to my colleague, Penny Smalley, who is the Director of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs for the International Council on Surgical Plume. Together, Penny and I worked the bill through the legislative process by co-leading an Illinois-based grassroots coalition to seek passage of the surgical smoke plume evacuation law in our state of Illinois. This past week, as I was preparing for the presentation today, I came across a quote from Alice Walker that really resonated with me. And the quote states, "The most common way people give up their power is by thinking they didn't have any." So for those of you here today, if you have a practice issue that needs to be addressed through policy, don't give up, do something and act. And remember, it will take time to make policy changes. It takes persistence, perseverance, and dedication and good team members to get this type of work done. So this is exactly what Penny and I accomplished with the support of our Illinois-based coalition members who submitted witness slips and wrote letters to their legislators. And listed on this slide are the actions healthcare facilities can take in areas with pending legislation. Facilities can prepare by developing policies and procedures for reducing and eliminating exposure to surgical smoke. For the respective time today, I won't go into specific details of each item on the bulleted list. However, the takeaway messages for this slide is to share we have reliable technologies to capture, filter, and remove the surgical smoke plume produced from energy generating devices. And it takes a combination of smoke evacuation systems, engineering controls, administrative control, education, training, and awareness of the hazards to keep perioperative personnel free from harms related to surgical smoke exposure. And another important aspect when conducting a policy analysis is to locate resources and support. The smoke evacuation markets are estimated to reach $233 million by 2024. And the reasons for this include increased product availability, increasing preference for minimally invasive surgeries, and wider acceptance and availability of operating room protocols and guidelines for smoke evacuation systems. So these essentially, these items I mentioned are the major factors driving the growth of this market. So many device companies, professional organizations, and experts in the field provide support and resources for surgical smoke evacuation education and compliance measures. Some vendor companies offer rewards and recognize hospital facilities for meeting the qualifications of implementing, providing education to their staff, and measuring compliance and auditing their systems they have in place. And we have experts from around the world who have dedicated their careers to the science and standards. So when in doubt about the best approach to take to keep perioperative personnel free from the hazards of surgical smoke plume, be sure to contact them as they want to help you. So the main point of this slide is to share with you that this type of information is helpful to know and locate for your policy analysis, because you will need to offer a recommendation to address the policy issue at hand, while at the same time determining that feasibility of the solution and/or determine if there even is a solution out there to resolve the problem. So it's okay to reach out to experts if you are exploring an issue via policy analysis. They will be able to provide you with information you may not have thought of. And Congress.gov is the official website to locate U.S. federal legislative information. This site allows you to query and save searches. You can treat this like your library university account and save your searches. You can use this website to locate a bill and follow current activities such as watching floor proceedings, viewing House and Senate schedules, and you can subscribe for alerts for bills of interest to you. And for those of you in the audience today who may be from California, I included this slide as a point of reference to locate the legislative activity in your state. If you are interested in exploring your state legislative activity and resources, you can go to the California Legislature site. And when you begin to conduct a policy analysis, you will want to identify if the problem is focused around state legislation or federal legislation. I know I spent a lot of time on the state legislature pages throughout the US. And now we would like to discuss more about the policy analysis we conducted. The previous information we have provided to you was helpful information we needed to conduct our analysis. I would like to mention for anyone in the audience today, my slides for some reason like to auto advance at this point, so let me back up. So I would like to mention for anyone in the audience today, starting off as a new professor in academia or for an established professor that has a strong background in policy, conducting a policy analysis is a great way to get your scholarly work started because it will open future opportunities via presentations, publications, and advocating for legislation at the state and federal levels. You can also establish a great mentor-mentee partnership. So it is really quite an interesting story of how our policy analysis work evolved. Let me share a little bit about my story with you today and how I found my love for policy work. So in the fall of 2019, Dr. Thorlton and I embarked on this journey of conducting a policy analysis on surgical smoke laws, and we focused our work on spreading awareness to nursing executives who may not be in tune to some of the workplace safety issues specific to the perioperative environment. As perioperative nurses, we have opportunities to share workplace issues with our executive leaders at our facilities and ask for support, because our executive leaders can be great allies and a voice for perioperative team members. So it's just a really fascinating story. And let me go back about 10 years. And in 2011, I began working as a registered nurse in the operating room. And I didn't understand why we only evacuated surgical smoke during laser cases, when clearly in cases like total joint replacements and practically every procedure we performed generated an excessive amount of surgical smoke when our surgeon colleagues used the cautery, also known as electrosurgery. And we should have been evacuating surgical smoke plume when the cautery was activated, just as we would when we used the laser machine during procedures. So as a new nurse, this was really confusing and puzzling to me, especially since we were following our designated policy at the facility, but the policy was only focused on laser procedures and did not pertain to all energy generating devices. So now let's flash forward to several years later, and as an active ARN member, the topic of surgical smoke still puzzled me. I didn't understand why our facility wasn't doing more to protect the staff from surgical smoke in all cases where surgical smoke was generated. After reading the published research and taking advantage of resources provided by various professional organizations, standards, and guidelines, I joined a surgical smoke evacuation committee at my facility. And on this committee, a team of nurses, department leaders, scrub techs, and our surgical techs implemented a policy and procedure, and we implemented the practice to evacuate surgical smoke using evacuation systems on any case where surgical smoke plume was produced. And we also trialed various products with our surgeons because we wanted to have their buy-in as well. So in 2019, I joined the University of Illinois, Chicago as a faculty member and partnered with Dr. Thorlton, who not only used to work in the OR as a nurse, but also is an expert in policy. So I was talking to her about the concerns I had with surgical smoke, and we decided to conduct a policy analysis. So this policy paper introduced me to the policy arena and the many opportunities involved in policy. And in this slide, I've included a snapshot of our paper that is online in the Nurse Leader Journal. And then from this policy work, I took a huge step to push for a surgical smoke plume evacuation law in Illinois and co-led the initiative with Penny Smalley, where we successfully achieved passage of Senate Bill 1908, surgical smoke plume evacuation. And we're so pleased to share that our Illinois governor signed the bill into law on August 20th, so just a few weeks ago. I often think back and remind myself how fortunate I was to have been mentored by Dr. Thorlton and to conduct this policy analysis and then connect with an expert in the field, Penny Smalley, where together we worked the bill and got it enacted into law, all through grassroots efforts. So that's really the story. And now we'll jump into some our key stakeholders. One very important step in conducting a policy analysis includes identifying your key stakeholders on the issue. And it's important to remember there is no magic formula to determine who your stakeholders are. When identifying our stakeholders, we wanted to know what professional organizations and regulatory bodies were doing about the issue. So we've listed several of them here. And on my next slide, I'll show you an example of one. The Joint Commission, we were so pleased to see that they released a quick safety alert in December 2020, signifying that they are concerned with the issue and they are recommending actions to take to protect patients and perioperative personnel from the dangers of surgical smoke plume. And another great resource to explore when writing a policy analysis is to investigate the special interest group by going to opensecrets.org. OpenSecrets.org is the Center for Responsive Politics and is nonpartisan, independent, and a nonprofit group that is the nation's premier research group tracking money in the United States. So you can conduct searches on this site to see how much money organizations are giving to various party lines and what bills they are supporting. So it's very interesting to explore. And lastly, here we've noticed our 3 policy options that we analyzed in our paper. The first one was that healthcare facilities adopt their own policies and procedures. The second option was individual states enact smoke evacuation laws. And the third option was take a do nothing approach. So we know that little progress has been made to ensure surgical smoke evacuation practices are implemented in hospitals and ambulatory surgery centers. The practice isn't consistent across the nation. So if a state doesn't have a law on this practice, it is up to the individual healthcare facility to adopt policies and procedures. So we are pleased to see those 5 states that have been successful in doing this. And just remember, the legislators are interested in many factors such as the cost benefit, political feasibility, and legal issues when you're coming up with those policy options. And lastly, we chose that individual states enact surgical smoke evacuation laws as our recommendation. And here are a few takeaway messages as we conclude our presentation today. First, surgical masks our perioperative personnel wear in the operating room do not provide protection against airborne particles contained in surgical smoke. And the most effective method of safeguarding against surgical smoke involves its removal with a dedicated smoke evacuation system and device. And we strongly recommend all states across the United States adopt surgical smoke evacuation laws. And just as a reminder, if you are interested in our paper and would like to know more about it, you can find it online, and it will also be in print in the November issue of Nurse Leader. And before we conclude this session today, I would like to take a moment and share that writing this policy analysis was the first step in beginning my scholarly pursuit as a new clinical assistant professor. And conducting this policy analysis has helped me to further the work by meeting experts in the field and working with the experts to advocate and push for surgical smoke legislation in Illinois and to contribute to the body of evidence in the literature. So if you are on the webinar today and interested in getting involved in the policy arena or starting off your career in academia, I highly recommend partnering with a policy expert and begin writing a policy analysis, because it will really open up so many opportunities for you to be a leader and an advocate for a problem that needs addressed. We thank you for your attention and for attending today. And now we will take your questions.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. That was just a wonderful presentation. If anybody has any questions, you can add them into the Q&A box in Zoom. It's a little better for chat because chat does get a little clunky sometimes and we can't get to all the questions. So if you do have a question, please move it over into the Q&A box and I will start going through those now. So the first question, has there been a hazard characterization performed on surgical smoke to identify the constituents of concern and their associated health effects? For example, particulate gases, chemicals, etc.
Could you repeat the beginning of that question? I didn't quite hear.
Yes. Has there been a hazard characterization performed on surgical smoke to identify the constituents of concern and their associated health effects? For example, particulate gases, chemicals, etc.
Oh, I'm sorry, a hazard characterization. Yeah, there's in guidelines and standards, they do identify the hazards, and they break it down by the types of tissue and the type of device being used.
Thank you. So the next question, if surgical smoke evacuators cannot be achieved, i.e. hospitals have old or existing ORs where those controls haven't been implemented or are not working sufficiently, are there recommendations for PPE, personal protective equipment, for chemical and or biological hazards?
So it's a combination of engineering controls, administrative controls. You need to have your those dedicated capture devices to filter that surgical smoke that's produced. So it's a combination of practices, but the most effective is your surgical smoke evacuation system. A mask won't be the cure-all for this.
Thank you. And by the way, Janet, feel free to hop in at any time. Dr. Thorlton. What are some of the chemical constituents of surgical smoke? I think we kind of talked about that one already. And so the next question, if you want, do you have a further answer for that?
Well, you know, benzene, toluene, it can mimic carbon monoxide poisoning. So just to name a few, but there's about 60 to 600 plus.
And in your experience, has surgical smoke been recognized as a respiratory hazard and required full respiratory protection program?
I am not aware of a full respiratory protection program, but that's very interesting. Thank you for that question. I'll have to look into that.
And let's see, does the respiratory protection vary with the type of surgical procedure, or is it a standard, a paper type mask?
So the surgical masks do not protect you against surgical smoke, because we in the OR we have procedural masks that we wear, and those are to protect the patient, not to protect us from that surgical smoke.
Thank you. Okay, the next question: have exact chemicals of concern been identified, or is it simply particulate matter? Also, follow up to that is, personal breathing zone monitoring been performed in the studies?
That's a great question, and I would have to refer back to the literature to give you the specific details. There's a lot of published research, and so it's difficult for me to remember and recall it all, but I certainly can help you find that information if you would like to email me.
Great, thank you. Let's see, and is there a reliable summary available online of the current surgical plume regulations enacted?
Yes, if you're interested in knowing the state's laws, you can visit every legislature page for that information. So those states were Illinois, Oregon, Rhode Island, Colorado, and Kentucky.
Thank you. All right, next, do the smoke evacuation devices also capture other airborne materials such as mists and energetically discharged particles from orthopedic procedures?
That's a really great question, and that's one that I haven't explored yet, but I think I will. Thank you for that.
We do use, the rooms also have additional ventilation in the ceilings for certain, for example, TB. You know, that's a different topic, but they configure certain operating rooms with a separate ventilation system to protect the healthcare workers. If a patient has TB, they can go ahead and do the procedure, and the room ventilates a certain way. So there are lots of other measures that we use, but to answer that particular question about orthopedic procedures and other particles, I'm not sure. And then I can't remember if I mentioned earlier about in some orthopedic procedures, we're using cements that have like off-gassing that corresponds with the use of those cements. And those have been implicated in Parkinson's disease in some people. They believe there may be a relationship later down the road from having breathed in orthopedic cement over the years.
Oh, wow. And so the next question kind of follows in line, but are you aware of smoke extraction design? Oh, actually, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry. So are you aware of smoke extraction design standards that industrial hygienists or other occupational health professionals use to commission and evaluate smoke extraction systems?
So that's a really great question. And I personally am not involved in working with engineers and on that occupational side. You know, my work has solely been on this policy paper and conducting some research on concerns of nurses. But that's a really great question. And I'm sure that there are folks out there who are working on that. I mean, it is these devices that we use, they are tested, and the efficacy is documented in the literature.
I would like to interject a thought on what you're talking about. A few years ago, I worked for Regan Street Healthcare Engineering, and it was a great experience. As a nurse, I worked with all materials engineers, industrial engineers, human factors engineers, and it was such a great place. It was a true interprofessional working relationship. And what we find is that oftentimes we're so siloed in our own professions. This is why a lot of programs in the university are, as part of your accreditation now, we have to begin showing how we are having healthcare students work together with other disciplines. So nurses working with medical students, pharmacy students, physical therapy students, that type of thing. And what I found working for Regan Street was the engineers very much are interested in getting their foot in the door to work with nurses, but it's such an imposing situation. They're not going to just let you in and walk onto a nursing unit and friends. You know, it's a little difficult to reach out and form those collegial relationships. And so we're trying harder in academia to begin breaking the ice that way, so that we feel we can reach out and form these partnerships. Very few times in my nursing career have I ever been approached by an engineer to say, hey, you do this job every day. What are the things that you think are not working with this piece of equipment? And what do you think could be better? And we now, with artificial intelligence and the way IV pumps, for example, are programmed, they're collecting data and they can see the number of times overrides are hit on alarm settings and that type of thing. But we need to do a better job across the nation of coming together and working together for the sake of the patient. And we're trying to do that.
And there are international standards, and these folks need to comply with them when they build those plume evacuation systems as well.
Thank you both so much. That's very detailed, and I'm sure they appreciate it very much so. Let's see. So the next question. So for example, if a surgeon practices in different hospitals, who would be responsible for instituting the smoke evacuation equipment, and who might be most liable for claims if one of the staff contracted, let's say, cancer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that it's up to the healthcare facility where you are working at, needs to have the facility, and all the personnel working at that facility need to comply.
I could add to that a little bit. There's a whole formal credentialing process for a surgeon to work in, let's say in one town, 3 different clinics. You go through a credentialing process at each facility, and built within that approval process, risk management is involved, and the hospital risk management oftentimes is overseen by an attorney. And they work very closely to help the surgeons be able to get the equipment that they would like to have on hand and get all of these approvals in place. So it's really a little bit of a complex process, but there is a mechanism.
Great, and to kind of to build upon that, one of our attendees asked, short of lawsuits, one would expect there to have been some workers' compensation claims filed by exposed personnel who've experienced severe respiratory outcomes, such as those who would require bilateral lung transplants that were mentioned. Insurance claims are typically under the radar of advocates. How do we know if there have been numerous expensive workers' compensation claims paid to date?
That's another tricky one, because you have to prove damages. And of course, you're going to have one side saying, how do we know that you didn't have a pre-existing condition? Or how do we know you don't go vaping on the weekends and the vaping didn't cause, you're vaping in an unsanitary vaping practice, or maybe heredity. We're now in this era where we're learning more and more about the genome, and maybe we are predisposed genetically to certain things. It would be really hard to prove, but it does. In the hospital, nurses have an opportunity to file what's called an incident report. And we're taught to kind of start a paper trail. And so maybe what happens is a number of these reports over time that are clustered by department, and we begin to see patterns. That's what it takes, is for people to come forth and report these things through incident reports. And there are, again, departments in a hospital that track these types of reports, but you have to have multiple people across time in order to catch the attention. In terms of actual amount of money being paid out, I don't have any figure on that. I don't know if Dr. Vortman does.
We did not uncover anything in that area when we conducted our policy analysis. However, as states do begin to enact laws, and depending who the reporting agency is for facilities, for example, if you're reporting to your public health department, if the facility is reporting compliance to the public health department, I would suspect perioperative personnel could report if the facility is not complying with the law, and that would require an investigation.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and do one more question. We're a little bit over time, but somebody asked a little bit earlier. Do robotics and laser surgery, in your experience, minimize exposure?
That's a really great question, and you would think it would, but in laparoscopy, there have been studies performed. What happens is all of that surgical plume is staying in the belly, and it actually has implications for the staff and the patient. So there's a really great study. It was conducted in 2014, and it's called the chemical composition of surgical smoke formed in the abdominal cavity during laparoscopic cholecystectomy, lap chole. So you should read up on that study. I'm trying to think of the details off the top of my head, but they performed urinalysis on patients pre and post the procedure, and the patient's benzene and toluene levels were statistically higher in the patients when they didn't evacuate the surgical smoke. So again, I don't have all the specifics on that study, but that's a really great question. And there's great articles and research that have been conducted on the minimally invasive procedure. So it's still harmful. And we do have devices that can capture and filter the contaminants in the surgical smoke plume.
We are willing to if that person has a specific question, our email addresses are on the last slide. And the AORN is also running a virtual series right now on this very topic of robotic assisted surgery best practices.
Thank you for that. Also, any resources or articles that you can share with us, we can always send out tomorrow with the email that we'll send with the recording of the webinar. Okay, so do you guys have anything else to add?
We just thank you so much for attending, and we hope you found this information helpful to your practice.
Okay, thank you so much. And I appreciate you guys being here. Thank you to all of our attendees for coming and spending some time with us today to learn about this topic. We will be back again next Tuesday, I think, for our webinar, and we will see you then. Everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.